Hi, everybody, and welcome to this Facebook Live event. This is my first time trying this, so be patient with me and bear with me as I try to work out how to do this as a live broadcast. My goal is to try to is to at least invite and encourage some conversation, and so if you are joining us by if you're kind of tuning in, then I encourage you and invite you to post in the comments. That's kind of the part that I'm trying to figure out here exactly how to do that, how to moderate the comments while I do this. But in any case, you should be able to post, and I can. My goal is to engage and interact with some of the thoughts and the questions that come up as they come up. So we'll do that if comments are brought up now. My hope and my plan in all of this is to at least have some conversation concerning a lot of the recent events that we've been seeing in our own community here in Salem, but also around the country, around the nation. A lot of unrest, and so I want us to I kind of want to look at the question of why should we, as Christians, working from a Christian worldview here, why should Christians care about this? How do we do that, and what does that actually look like? A couple of just, yeah, I guess housekeeping rules or kind of how this will work. I've really got four main things that we're going to talk about, kind of four little topics, and I'm going to just say a few things and work through some of those things, and then I'll allow some time for I'll kind of pause at the end of them, and then if there are questions that come up or comments or thoughts, we can kind of interact and engage that way. And then before we move on to the next topic, at any point in the conversation, of course, feel free to throw up a question or comment. That's of course more than welcome. So please do feel free to do that. I do ask and request that you keep this as civil and as respectful as you can, even with people that you may or may not agree with. This is meant to be a dialogue that's meant to promote good conversation and good thinking, and it's really hard to do that if we're criticizing and attacking people. So if you are taking that approach, then obviously the comments will be ignored and you'll be removed from the forum. Okay, so first, I kind of got to questioning: is this even a good idea to do? Is it really a wise move to post a video and a conversation that has to do with race and race relations? And if so, why? Why now? Because there are some that I think will say, well, you're actually about 2 weeks too late on this topic. This whole issue on this issue on police brutality, racism, etc., really jumped into the headlines about 2 weeks ago. And so, if you're going to address it, then you should address it in the moment. That's a fair point. There are others that would say, well, actually, jumping into a politically charged issue like this is really just not a good idea at all. And so you're better off avoiding the topic altogether. Just focus on being the church. Just focus on, preaching the gospel, and leave the political stuff to other people. So I've actually heard both approaches. So I guess my question that I think I need to start out with is why is it that as Christians why should we approach this issue? Why is it, even as a church, it's important and necessary, I think, and helpful to approach this issue? There's some that will say, and here's where I'll start. There's some that say, well, why did you wait? Why if you really wanted to weigh in on this and have a voice on this issue, then you really should have done this 2 weeks ago. Why are you waiting until now? Christians need to speak into the issue in the moment. They need to be addressing these issues as they come up, not waiting, until they're, until things have, already well underway. I can answer that. I think I've had a couple thoughts on that. Both my wife and I are part of a different Facebook groups. I'm part of one has to do with a lot of different pastors and pastoral issues. My wife is part of one that is for athletes, and in both of our cases, two very separate Facebook groups, two very separate groups of people. In both groups, over the last couple of weeks, they both became very, very charged with issues surrounding race and racism and accusations, and it became very, very polarized, and the environment very quickly got quite toxic. There's really a mindset, and you've seen this in lots of different places. You've seen it on your own Facebook feed, in your own social media circles. You've seen it in your conversations with other people. The mindset is, unless you agree with me 100%, unless you think the way that I think, there's something wrong with you. And so there's a great deal of pressure to make people think the way that you do, and to share your exact beliefs, and that can become very, very polarizing, and that's a sort of a tinderbox, especially in the life of the church. Things can fall apart very quickly. And as a church, we're concerned to protect the unity of the church by not starting, not sowing division where there is, where there ought not to be none. And so sort of the hesitation there has to do with wanting to preserve and not throw kindling on an issue that's already so charged. The other thing that is, I got to think about this, is we live in a culture that is so pressured. We feel so much pressure where everybody has to make a statement. Everybody has to take a stance on an issue. Everybody has to, speak out and articulate. It's sort of like, why is it that we feel this pressure to make statements? Why is it that we feel this pressure that everybody has to come out and articulate their viewpoints? And I think part of the reason for that is, again, because we feel like we have to declare which side we are on. And Facebook and social media has made it very easy to at least on a surface level, to do that, to come out and sort of delineate those lines of where people are. And so I have been sort of resistant of that approach of just trying to, always wanting to take sides and declare which side you're on. And then, because if you know which side you're on, then you know which side you're not on, and you know who the enemy is. And so there's this real, I've had this real hesitancy to just speak automatically on every single issue and to just jump right into everything. However, there's some importance, I think, and there's something important about actually needing to speak, right? So there's wisdom in waiting, right? There's some wisdom in saying, look, we've got to let things play out a little bit, because actually you gain a little more wisdom as time passes. You gain a little bit more perspective, and so it's not necessary to jump into every single issue immediately. We don't do that. No church does that. No individual does that, right? We all are somewhat selective in terms of the issues that we address. And so as a church, I thought, okay, it's important, I think, at least to wait a little bit, not to jump right into the issue at hand. So that's why wait. Then the question is, why speak at all, right? If you have these concerns over polarization, if you have these concerns about not sowing division, why not just, some people say, well, just stick to being the church, just stick to preaching the gospel, just stick to church things. And that's actually, that's a fair point, and that's actually an important point. But there's a difference. I think there's a difference in, and I guess here's just a couple of responses to that. Why bother speak at all? A couple of things. First, it's true that the church is not a political entity, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a little bit. That is very true. We are not to be, as a church, we have to be very careful about how we enter into that political arena, how and when. But there is a difference between being partisan and speaking to issues that are relevant to our day. So, in other words, it may be good, it may be important for Christians to speak to issues that confront society at any given time, right? Society is always facing issues, whether it be racism or homelessness, whether it be economic disparity, whether it be international foreign trade relations, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. There's always issues that Christians can care passionately about, and biblically they can be shaped by them. Doesn't necessarily mean you speak on every single issue. However, there comes a time, I think, where certain issues just rise to that level of national consciousness, where to not speak up at all actually says a lot, right? So when an issue becomes so front and center, and the church is not able or is not willing to say anything, then the message comes out that the church is either, it's ill-informed, it doesn't have a message, it's ignorant, it's naive. And so I see this as an opportunity, at least for the church, to speak to articulate gospel principles that can help shape this dialogue and help shape this discussion. So that's my goal here. That's why I have this conversation. My goal is to here in the next hour or so, a little less than an hour now, to have civil conversation that is thoughtful and careful and tries to articulate some of these principles that can shape how we move forward, even if we as we'll see, we stay away from some of the particulars. But anyways, okay, so I want to leave a minute or two, and just if anyone has any comments or any, I see a few people are weighing in and watching, so I want to invite you, if you want to leave a comment at this point, or a question or a thought or reflection on that while I change my my sheet here, my cue cards, and get a drink of water. Okay. It's important when we talk about what is the church, language is really important. Obviously, it makes a big difference what you mean when you talk about the church. When you say that should the church be involved in political issues, should the church speak to issues that are confronting public policy and culture and society, we use the church, but we could all be meaning different things, and that obviously can create confusion. So there's historically the Reformed branch of the church has talked about the institutional church and the church as individuals. So in other words, you're talking about the church as an organized structure that sort of facilitates the ability for churches to worship. And so a lot of times you might think of that in terms of a denomination, or you might think of it in terms of the government and the structure of the church. But then you also have individual Christians. And you have individual Christians who go out and live out their calling as Christians in work and in home and in society and business, etc. So when I talk about the church over the next little bit, I'm mostly referring to that institutional structure of the church. So the question, should Christians be concerned about racism? The answer is, if you're an individual Christian, absolutely, you absolutely should. The institutional church will as well, but how both approach those is going to look different, as I think I'm going to try to show you that. So so the question is, what is the role of the church in all of this? How does the institutional church get involved and participate in, say, when the problem of racial injustice or racial tension, cultural differences, and so on? How does the church fit into all of that? On both sides, on both I'm talking about political sides, left and right, you'll see there's a very, very strong push for the church to get highly political, right? And both sides do this. So there's a strong push to get either the church to support policies, to support candidates, to encourage calls for action, to sign statements, to sign petitions, etc. And there's a push to get the institutional church and the representatives of the institutional church to sign, statements against racism, or to advocate for specific policies that are meant to, say, cut down on racism. So just take an example. The push towards, now it's called, and this is actually, I think, a really dangerous is maybe too strong of a word, but the movement towards defunding the police. That's the tagline that's being used. And it was being used in Minneapolis, it's being used in other places as well. So should the denomination and the institution of the church take a stand in favor of defunding the police? Is that, should the institutional church do that? Well, on the one hand, if you're calling for reform, you're calling for change in social structures and so on, you might say, well, that's a very good thing for the church to do. The church should stand for racial justice. The church should stand for reform. And that's, there are other examples we could come up with on that. There's a problem with that. So that's the push that we face. What you find in Scripture, though, if you go into the Bible, especially if you go into the New Testament, it's surprising to me how silent the Bible is when it comes to encouraging the Christians and encouraging the church as an institution or even as individuals to take strong political action. Now, that doesn't mean there's not a place for this, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit, but you don't see the Apostle Paul urging believers, to rise up and fight the policies of the Roman Empire. You see critiques of the worldview of the Roman Empire. You see challenges, brought against the ways of thinking and the cultural mores and values of the dominant worldview. But you don't see very much of a push towards social reform and fighting against the systems of the day. Now, you have to acknowledge right away that that's that's an argument from silence. You have to be a little careful with that, right? You're saying, well, the Bible doesn't specifically say. That doesn't mean it didn't necessarily happen, but I suspect it didn't. What you see is the apostles shaping the hearts and minds and the thinking of believers. And no doubt they went out and lived out their calling and their identity as Christians in lots of different ways. So it's my position that the church should be really, really, really careful when it takes, and again, institutional church, when it takes positions on, say, political candidates, specific policies or legislation, right? You don't see a lot of precedent for that in Scripture. You don't see necessarily, well, another reason is that the church doesn't necessarily have the competency. The institutional church doesn't have the competency to, say, evaluate, a piece of legislation that's being proposed or policies and so on. Historically, there's examples for this as well. In about the 4th century, you had an emperor by the name of Constantine. He became the emperor of Rome, and he sees all kinds of corruption. He sees all kinds of injustice and such, and he decides he becomes a Christian later in life, and he decides, I've got to actually Christianize the Roman Empire. I've got to enforce Christian morals and Christian values all across the entire Roman Empire. So that's what he does. He puts that into practice. And on the one hand, you'd say, well, that's very good. He's instituting Christian policies at a structural level in the Roman Empire. Best of motives, it didn't work out very well. It actually had a detrimental effect to Christianity in the long run. The same thing happened. You fast forward a few hundred years, and you get to the 1950s or so, and there was sort of a new movement in modern American evangelicalism to re-Christianize the country, to make America a Christian nation again. Again, best of intentions, but what happens is you end up trying to enforce Christian morality across the country. You try to put it in place everywhere you go, and that as good as that sounds, that's not the job of the church. And if you're wondering about that, or if that sounds strange to you, that's fair enough, but consider this. Where do you draw the line? In other words, do you want, if you want the church to enforce Christian morality, do you want the church, say, to enforce what used to be called blue laws, right? Laws about what you can and cannot do on Sundays. Do you want the church? Do you want to push for laws that say restrict taking the Lord's name in vain? And on it goes. So there is a line that has to be drawn, and historically the Reformed churches have tried to draw that line fairly carefully by not, as an institution, by not getting directly involved in the complexities and the nuances of public policy and politics. And it's not to say that the church doesn't have a voice in that, which we will get to in just a minute. But it is to say that the point and the purpose is that the institutional church is not to try to enforce political or Christian morality at a policy level across in government. Now, as Christians, we have to recognize that we live in a culture that is not. We can't necessarily expect it's going to adhere to Christian morality and Christian ethics. Again, Paul and Peter never attempted, and John and the other apostles never attempted to Christianize Rome. So they recognized that their role was to make disciples, to call people to faith in Jesus Christ, and to encourage them to live out their identity as Christians. But they were not Christianizing Rome. Now, what does the church do? The church, of course, preaches the gospel. It is meant to shape the hearts and minds of followers of Jesus Christ. It's meant to call them to faith and obedience, and then to send them out into the world, so that you actually get Christians who have been shaped by the gospel, and they're going into, politics, they're going into business, they're going into finance, they're going into law, and they're bringing their values to bear in all of those areas. But as an institution, the church is not actually doing these things. And of course, the church is called to care for and show kindness to victims of injustice, to those who are hurting. The church is to be an agent of Christ's mercy in the world. But there's a difference between doing all that and then actually trying to advocate for specific policies and candidates and other such things. Okay, that's sort of big picture stuff. I'm going to pause there for a moment as I try to reset up my my little cue cards here, and just allow a little time if there are any questions or comments at this point. I see Carolyn is joining us from Huntington Beach, California. Carolyn, good to have you with us. Welcome. I'll let anyone chime in if you want to leave a comment or a question at this point. Because the next, I think the next place that I want to go is specifics on race. How do as Christians, how do we make sense of this whole racial tension? What we've been experiencing in our country for the last 2 weeks, and actually, I mean, I say that, but of course, the problem goes way longer back in history than that, of course. But for the last 2 weeks, it's been put in the front and center of our culture again. How do we as Christians make sense of this? How do we try to understand racial conflict, racial tension? What's the solution biblically? That's kind of where I want to go next. We talk about Black Lives Matter, and that's actually okay. That's all well and good. That's a good, I think, a valid claim to make, and I think there's a place for that at face value, right? To remind us and to call to our consciousness that African American people have value, and often they have been treated as second-class citizens, and they've certainly felt and had this experience of feeling ignored and neglected by the broader culture. So that's all well and good. But yesterday, does that go far enough, right? Does that go far enough? Does that take us far enough into the real issues? And Heather, I see a question. I'll get to that in just a second. I think it's a good question that you're asking. We'll come to it in a second. Yesterday, I saw a headline in my local paper here in Salem, which said, and I don't remember it exactly, I'm paraphrasing it. It said something like this: Native Americans want part of the Black Lives Matter movement, which was a way of saying, okay, so you're going to single out one culture, one ethnicity as being mistreated. And that's true, but then what about Native American culture? Native American culture also has a long history of being neglected and overlooked and actually horribly mistreated throughout the history of the United States. So how do you why is it that we focus on one particular culture or one ethnicity? I saw it. So that's one challenge, right? Why single out one group and not others when really the fact is that racial tensions go much broader than just between African Americans and white people. There's a long history of that. There are other people that have, and I saw this video floating around that said, well, race is just a social construct, and the idea of that that posting was that oops, I'm getting a chat window pop up here, totally unrelated. So all right, sorry about that. The idea was that it turns out the video actually had more to say about is race actually a social construct? There was more to the video than that. That was kind of making the case that and there was actually a lot to affirm in that. But the idea of this in this video that was going around that said race is just a social construct. It's just something that human beings invent. The idea being that we all trace our lineage back to Adam, and now I think the video came across as being a little bit there's only a clip, so you couldn't get the whole context of this video. But I think the video came across as maybe not recognizing the diversity of cultures that exist. I mean, it was kind of just, it sort of communicated the idea that we're all just one and forget about all the diversity and the differences, which, as I'm going to try to point out, is I think is problematic. But I'll get to that in a minute. But there's a valid point in all that. Okay, so you want to talk about white people. Well, fine. Are you referring to Canadians, Americans? Are you referring to Romanians or Russians? Are you talking about people from South Africa? Or you talk about black people? Are you talking about people from Uganda? Are you talking about people from Kenya? The point is that actually the idea of racial differences, it goes much deeper than just race. It's not just race, but actually it's culture, it's ethnicity, it's a whole it's a whole host of different things that begin to define us, and it's more than just skin color. It's our cultural background, it's our cultural heritage, and so on. So my point is, it's not enough to just, if you really want to take this whole issue of race seriously, I think you need to think bigger, and you got to go beyond just, well, Black Lives Matter. You have to look at the actual, the whole, the reality that there are a whole bunch of races, cultures, and ethnicities all kind of joined together, and racial tension is it sort of involves all of it in different ways, and you have to look at how do you address all of that. I'm going to pause here for just a second, and before I go on to defining the biblical, how I think the Bible defines the problem, I'm going to jump back to a couple questions that have come up. Heather asks, could there be no evidence for involvement in Scripture because the government was just different during the time the Bible was written? I think that's a possibility. As I said, there's an argument from silence here that you have to always be careful with, right? If you say, well, the Bible doesn't say it, you can't necessarily come to a positive conclusion based on silence. So you have to concede that that's a possibility. On the other hand, I would think that if this was to be a major part of of Christian living in the first century, I would think that you'd see something. You'd see some evidence of encouraging the Christians to act on their beliefs and their convictions in some way in the political arena as a church, if that makes sense. But there is nothing, and so that at least leaves me to be somewhat suspicious. Now, again, I've got to concede that it's not an open and shut case. There is that possibility that the Bible, the biblical times were different. And again, I think that difference plays out in the sense that, okay, so in Roman times, obviously you didn't go to the polls and elect. You didn't elect your Caesar or your senators, at least not that I'm aware of. Not an expert in ancient Roman culture, but and nowadays we do. So, that difference plays into it, I think, a little bit. But I think certainly as Christians we get involved, and our convictions ought to be shaping our approach to, say, elections and the stances that we take as individuals. I'm not sure that that it takes on the institutional shape that I talked about. Robert asks, is the CRC thinking about influencing policy on police matters, and what about federal law enforcement agencies? To my knowledge, there's nothing currently that the CRC is considering in that way. So, the discussion of what is the CRC taking positions on is an increasing discussion in our circles. But to my knowledge, there's nothing at this point on police matters or federal law enforcement agencies. Okay, so the problem and the issue here of racial tension, I would suggest, is it ought to be bigger. It ought to be bigger than just Black Lives Matter. We ought to be looking at the full picture, and you ought to be considering, okay, what about different ethnicities and cultures, and we maybe even need a more fleshed out definition of what race actually is. I think biblically, when you again, I mentioned this video that I saw earlier today that said, well, race is just a social construct. It was by a somewhat well-known pastor, and he was making the case that there's no such thing as race. We're all just part of the human race, and he points out. I mean, it's hard to argue that. At least if you take the biblical position seriously, you trace your lineage. It goes all the way back to Adam and Eve, right? So, in other words, the biblical picture is that we're all just one human race. And I sort of take that as a yes, if a yes, but, and I want to nuance that a little bit, which I think I will in a minute. But there's something very basic about that, right? Human beings, the Bible teaches that we are all human beings, all created in the image of God. If you go back to the very beginning, you have human beings, you have Adam and Eve, created in God's image. And that's an important part, right? Because our whole understanding of how do you treat other people, how do you treat people of different races, should be clearly rooted in the idea that we are dealing with image bearers of God, right? And that was the horrors of, especially in earlier American history, the horrors of treating African Americans as less than human. In reality, we all, our understanding of how do you treat other people of different races, is rooted in this idea that we're all one human race, we're all created in the image of God. However, the Bible also teaches, of course, that the effects of sin are not just vertical, right? They don't just deal with our relationship with God, but they're also horizontal. And if you start following the chapters of Genesis out, beginning in chapter 3, you find that there's brother on brother violence, and the culture deteriorates very quickly. And by the time you get to chapter 11, Genesis chapter 11, you actually find the story of the Tower of Babel, which is a fairly well-known story. And what you find is this attempt to seek self-glorification of human beings, right? Human beings want to exalt themselves instead of what they're supposed to be doing in terms of giving the glory to God. And God comes down and judges that, and the effect of that is that actually you get this dispersion of peoples. You get the separation of peoples out into all their different cultures and races and ethnicities. One of the messages of the story is that ultimately what happens is we begin to cluster together with people of our own race. Or another way to say it is we begin to find and build our identity on our racial or our cultural or our ethnic heritage. And maybe another way to look at that is to say that we actually all tend to start to view the world through the lens of ethnicity. There's been tons of studies on this that actually, let me say this. I think what that tells us is that racism, and I'm or kind of reinforcing these divisions between people groups is not kind of something that only a few people struggle with. But I actually would make the case that biblically it shows us that it goes very deep into who we are. A very deeply woven into us, a part of the sinful nature that's woven into us is this fact that we cluster with people like us, and we sort of default to sticking with them and viewing people like us, and then we tend to be suspicious of people who are different from us. I think that's just part of our nature that is a result of the fall. Now, it doesn't mean that we're all KKK type people who, think about nothing but hateful things in our hearts and in our minds about people of different races. But it does mean that it's just sort of this way of looking at the world in which we tend to cluster with people like us, and we tend to keep our, at least we sort of keep people at arm's length a little bit just by default. And I would say, too, I've had the great opportunity and privilege of traveling around a great deal to different countries, and racism is not in any way a uniquely American issue or problem. In fact, every country that I visited, every single one, without exception, deals with this issue at some level, whether it be different tribes that sort of are suspicious of each other, whether it be in Canada, it's Anglos and French Canadians, or Canadians and Native Canadians. So everywhere you go, you get different people of different groups, and there's kind of suspicion and tension between different ethnic, racial, or cultural groups. So in other words, racism is not a uniquely white problem. It's not a uniquely American problem. It seems to me that it's more a fundamentally human problem. And I would also point out that I think racism can be one of these things that operates under the radar. In other words, we can have our assumptions about other people and about other people of other groups. We can even say things, and we kind of make comments about other people, and we don't even realize that what we're saying comes off as being very insensitive to them in terms of their culture. I've had it more than once where people, and sorry, I'm not quite sure how to say this best, but it's usually a generational thing, because people from a generation earlier than my own will say things that people in my generation will kind of inwardly at least cringe about. And I'm not saying that to boast, because I know that in 30 or 40 years, my kids will probably cringe when I say something insensitive, because you don't realize always that some of these assumptions are at work. You don't realize the way that some of the things you're saying actually come across as being insensitive. I've had people come to me and said, I didn't realize it until later on, that actually, I was actually saying something that was very insensitive. It was racially insensitive to people from different backgrounds. So these assumptions they're not always right front and center in our mind. They often can operate kind of below the surface. And so if you might be sitting here, you might be thinking, well, I'm not a racist, and okay, but maybe let's start from the point that actually we operate from we make assumptions, or we look at people differently, and we might not even always realize that we're doing it. And I think that is owing to the biblical definition of the problem. In other words, the biblical to understand the problem accurately, you have to say that it's not. Well, look at it this way. I mean, we've couched the language today, these last couple of weeks especially, in terms of if you disagree with me, you're just a white supremacist, you just believe in white privilege, etc. And all those terms are all so loaded, and it's just kind of a way of we're looking at, I think it's not a good way to handle and approach the problem or the solution. I think if you understand the problem differently, it's kind of this something that operates at a very deep level of our heart and mind. I think that's what you need in order to work towards the correct solution, because the solutions today, I think what you see, and my big criticism of so much of what I see today, is the vitriol, it's the hatred for the people who don't think exactly like me. In other words, if I'm going to fight for racial reconciliation, and you don't agree with every word that I say, and if you don't see the world exactly as I do, then you're nothing but a bigot, right? And we say I'm woke. I understand. I'm fighting for racial justice. And the irony of all of that, of course, is that you end up creating a whole new sort of us versus them mindset. So you're trying to fight against racial injustice, and presumably you're trying to actually promote some kind of harmony between people. But in the way that you go about doing it, if you take this approach, you end up creating actually more division. You end up creating more divide. So it's not. In fact, this is I want to be careful with this, because this is a much more scaled down illustration, but it's common nowadays in like corporations and companies and things to hold. If you want to promote diversity in your workplace, if you want to promote racial harmony, what do? You have Diversity Day, right? And The Office very famously the TV show The Office very famously satirized that. And sort of the picture there was that you do diversity training, and it feels very patronizing, and it can feel very condescending. And actually, there are studies that have shown that those kinds of approaches to fixing what's the tension actually makes it worse, because you're just reinforcing all the differences, rather than focusing on what holds people together. Now, I would even raise this critique against the institutional church, because I think too often the institutional church has just taken a page out of the playbook of the broader culture. We've just said, well, look, we need to be diverse, and yet we need to be united. And the church mirrors and mimics the language that is so marked by vitriol and anger and hostility and hatred. I've wondered more and more, how is the church's approach to addressing this issue? Is it rooted in the gospel, or is it just sort of more surface level changes? And so I would encourage the church, and I would encourage us as Christians to think through, how does the gospel come to bear on all of this, right? So if we understand the solution, if we understand the problem as being something fundamentally wrong with the human heart, then how does the solution, how does the gospel give us a better solution, right? If the world sees this just as, well, people are, they're just divided at surface levels or whatever, how does the church offer something, and how can the church interpret this differently and offer a different solution? And I think the answer is, and I'll try to speed up here a little bit and then give a little time for your comments. If you have comments, feel free to start typing them in so that I can address them when I get to a break here. The biblical solution to the problem of racism begins with, especially, well, you see it in the ministry of Jesus, because Jesus is always crossing these cultural barriers and these ethnic boundaries that were so divisive, right? You read that he's always crossing into different territories where, the Samaritans live or where Romans were, and he's sort of modeling this approach to crossing cultural, what were cultural barriers. But the story of Pentecost really cements the idea of biblical racial, ethnic, cultural reconciliation. So Pentecost is sort of the reversal of Babel, right? If at Babel you get all these nations that are scattered together, and then people begin to divide themselves more and more by racial and cultural identities, and they sort of build their identities on their racial and cultural backgrounds. Pentecost says, okay, once again you have all the nations together in one place, right? Acts 2 makes that very clear. And once again, God comes down, but this time he's not coming down in judgment. This time he's coming down to actually fill his people with the Holy Spirit. And the idea being that now, rather than God scattering the nations, he's actually joining them together, and he's filling them with the Spirit, and he's so that now he's creating this new people for himself. And I'm kind of racing through a lot of New Testament biblical history here, but what God is actually doing in the church is he's actually recreating this new nation, as it were, and it's a nation made up of many nations. So in other words, the New Testament does not erase or do away with ethnic or racial or cultural backgrounds or identities. It doesn't do away with it at all. In fact, in Revelation chapter 1, you see this picture of in heaven of all nations from all parts of the world all coming together. And heaven then becomes sort of made up of this multicultural group of people. So actually, the New Testament is very affirming of culture and cultural diversity, but rather than build our identity on our cultural background, rather than primarily building our identity on the fact that you're, say, from the United States or Canada or Holland or South Africa or Ukraine or Russia, wherever, your identity is primarily built on your relationship to Jesus, right? So that's what Pentecost begins this work of doing. There's a story in Galatians chapter 2 where you get Peter. Peter, it took him a little bit to sort of break through this old way of thinking. And what Peter does, so Peter, he on one level knew that the barriers between Jew and Gentile had been broken down. On another level, he was still kind of struggling to live that out. So there's a scene where Peter is sitting down for dinner, and he was sitting with some Gentiles, and then he decides, well, he was worried a little bit what other Jewish people might think if he crossed that cultural barrier. So what does he do? He instead gets up, takes his tray of food, and goes and sits down next to some other Jewish people. And Paul happened to be at the same meal. And he stands up and says, Peter, what in the world are you doing? Right? And he actually says, Peter, you've forgotten the gospel. In other words, Paul is kind of saying, when you reinforce that cultural divide, you're doing it not because you're some racial bigot, but because actually you're not living in line with what the gospel teaches. And without going into all the detail, what Paul is saying to Peter is, you have to remember that Jesus. Or that God calls you through Jesus, not because of your cultural superiority, not because you are somehow ethnically better than Gentile people. He calls you in spite of that. He calls people on the basis of grace. And that's what we're called to do as well. So for the Christian, the answer to racial, cultural, and ethnic divisions is not found in superficial sorts of approaches, but actually it's a call back to the gospel. It's a call to say, look, I build my sense of who I am not on my cultural identity, although you have that, and although that that plays a part in who you are, but your ultimate identity is not built on a cultural or ethnic distinction, but on your relationship to Jesus. Now again, that picture in Revelation reminds us that actually we have every reason in the world to enjoy and to appreciate and to value the varied cultural backgrounds and to value what is good in all cultures. We should affirm those. We should value them as Christians. We're called to love our neighbors of all cultural backgrounds as we love ourselves, right? Loving our neighbor means loving people as we love ourselves. But racial reconciliation, as the Bible describes it, is accomplished through the work of the gospel. Because that gives us the humility, right? You can't it completely destroys any effort that we might make to see ourselves as culturally superior to other people. You can't see yourself as, well, I'm white, so I'm better than person who's African American or Native American or Asian or Hispanic or whatever. You can't, your cultural identity does not define you. You simply say, well, you're primarily defined by your relationship to Jesus. But it also gives us a vision. It also gives us a picture of what we ought to be seeking after. Okay, I'm going to allow just a couple minutes. I'm going to take a breath, see if there's any questions or comments on any of this. All right. Let's talk a little bit about police brutality. And I want to be really careful about this because in some ways that's kind of been woven into this whole conversation. And what sense do we make of it? And I'm not going to say a whole lot about this because I actually think there's much that hasn't, maybe there's stuff that hasn't come out yet. Is it a real thing? Yeah, I think it is. I mean, I think you have to acknowledge that what happened, the video with George Floyd was absolutely horrific. And it should offend, I think, our sense of decency. I think, the question is this a racial issue? Was this, and I think that probably played a part in it. That's my sense of it. I'm not, I'm sure that played a sense in it. I think there are other factors at play too that I think are, at least worth considering. And one of them being, you've got in this case, you've got I think, at least my judgment of it is, you've got one bad apple. You've got a cop with something like 48 complaints against him. To me, it seems like we're dealing here with a cop who, maybe he's on a power trip, maybe he's some kind of bully or aggressor or something like that. Probably not cut out for police work. Now, this raises a whole lot of other questions. Why is a guy like this why is he not fired? Why is he not let go? I don't know all those things. I think it's worth pointing out too that it's easier for people on the outside to look in and make all kinds of suggestions about how the police work should be corrected and how the police structure should be fixed. Police work is obviously much more difficult than most of us ever realize. It was about 2-3 years ago, I went on a ride-along with our local police department, and I would strongly suggest that you do that once the whole COVID thing is over. You'll have the chance, most departments allow that. If you want a little up-close look at what police work is like, you ought to take that chance to do that, because you see pretty quickly that an ordinary traffic stop can turn really deadly without so much as a whisper of a notice. About a year ago here in Salem, we had we had an officer that was shot in the line of duty, and some of you know that I happen to listen to my police scanner, and I listen to that quite a bit just kind of for background noise, but I happened to hear that whole event as it went down right from the moment that the car was pulled over. And there was no indication whatsoever that this was going to go badly, and all of a sudden it did. What am I trying to get at with that? I'm not trying to say that there's not an issue or a problem, right? I'm not trying to say that, there's no corruption within the police department. I think there is, and I think it has to be addressed. But I'm also trying to just nuance that a little bit by recognizing how challenging and how difficult it is. And I think my sense is that 99.9% of all police officers go into the line of work because they care for their communities and they want to protect and care for the citizens, not because they're violent bullies and thugs, although, I think you probably get a few of those in there as well. Now, what do you how do you change the system? Again, we're nowadays the slogan over the last couple of days has been defund the police. Well, that's all well and good. You say that, but what does that actually mean? What are you hoping really to accomplish, right? And you have to, and I mean that seriously. Like, what is the goal in all of this? most of us, I think the honest truth is most of us lack the expertise. So anyways, I don't have a whole lot more to say on that, only because I'm not an expert on the matter, but I think it's worth pointing out. Devon, good to see you, and thanks for joining in. I'm going to pause again, and I've got really one more issue to touch on, but I want to give a minute if you have comments or questions or thoughts on that. I know that's kind of a hot button issue. I hope it doesn't sound like I'm trying to give police a pass on any of this. They should be held accountable, for their actions in ways that are appropriate. But we have to be careful. Okay, one final issue. I saved the most controversial for last. So, if you're still watching, you're in for probably the most hot button issue, which had to do with something that took place about a week ago. I think it was a week ago today. So last week Monday. And that was the evening in when the president crossed the White House and he cleared the square of protesters. And, my understanding is they used pepper spray to clear the protesters. And then he walked across the street and stood in front of the church. And he raised his Bible. It was actually it was a bizarre scene, because he didn't say much at all. I mean, maybe 2 sentences, but it was just a photo op where he was standing there holding the Bible. Now, why do I bring all of that up? Well, I said earlier that the church needs to always be mindful of those lines between where is the church's area of expertise and competence and where is it not. And so, I think the church has the ability to speak into issues like racism, and we can articulate those principles and such. There are other things you have to be a little more tentative about, but I also think, and I also believe, that this is an area where, the president is handling Scripture, right? He's handling the Bible, so that definitely falls into the realm of what the church is all about. It's true that many leaders, in fact, you might even argue most leaders in different ways, use sacred symbols, usually the Bible or a church and stuff. Let's see. Oh, I got a comment from Nora. Nora, thank you for weighing in. I'll make a comment on that in a second. When the president uses the Bible or uses sacred symbols, as many of them do, they do it all to greater or to lesser degrees. But I think as Christians we need to be very, very cautious about that. To the extent that they use the sacred symbols of Christianity, they use Scripture, they use the church to appropriate their agenda. They're invoking the name of God, and I think it's important to recognize that they are invoking God's name as a way to support their cause or their position. Now, that is very, very shaky ground. I am of the opinion that I believe that the president's actions in that case were a violation of the third commandment. That's the third commandment calls us to honor God's name and to not lift it up in an empty fashion. And I believe that that's what this occasion this occasion was. And I believe that that's something as Christians we're called to speak clearly against. The Heidelberg Catechism, which is one of the it's one of the documents that the Reformed tradition has held to in terms of expressing our understanding of the of biblical truth, says that when it comes to the third commandment, we also must not be silent bystanders. God takes the use of His name very seriously. So I think that's worth noting as well. Okay, a couple comments. Nora, good to have you along. The killing of Floyd by the police have given blacks and minorities a venue to treat others harshly. Ashland was spit in his face and yelled at in Walmart, and of course I think I think there's something, you're exactly right about something there, which is that the protests sort of become a catalyst for people who just want to get out and cause trouble. And as I said earlier, we kind of looked at the ways that if people will say, well, if you don't take my opinion and my position, then they get very, very aggressive and violent towards people who don't think the same way. And there's no, that's really a terrible thing. There's really no excuse for that. I would be very careful about labeling blacks and minorities as the only ones doing that. I think that I think that's not what I've seen, and I think we have to be careful. It's true that there's always people that can co-opt peaceful movements for their own agenda, and I think wherever we see that, we need to reject that. But I don't want to turn this into, well, they're treating blacks and minorities are the ones treating other people harshly. There's no yeah, we have to be really careful about how we phrase that. How do we help the young people deal with things like this? I think and that's another good question, because they're trying to. I've got three kids myself, and one of them's in high school, and trying to help. How do you think through this? And I think by having these kinds of conversations, and by trying to try to help them nuance their thinking, to try to caution them from going against just what the mainstream flow of culture is and buying into that cultural narrative, but just asking questions that will challenge their thinking on these matters, I think is a place to start. Having good dialogue, and then I'm going to get into something in just a minute that I think can also help, which is this. So yeah, I'll fill that out. I'll fill that out more in a minute. Of course, yeah, a couple of you are sharing just different experiences, and yeah, we shouldn't support and stand by those who wish to, lash out at people just for the position that they hold. So what do you do about it all? I want to wrap this up by suggesting at least a couple things that you can do, very concrete things, and to Nora's question, to also help young people address these things. The first is, it often starts with reading good literature, reading good books. The one I can recommend personally is called Just Mercy. It's by Brian Stevenson. My understanding is that the movie is out as well, and it's free on most streaming platforms this month. The book is excellent. It's written by an African American who I think is like a Harvard Law graduate, and he begins to fight against systemic racism. Specifically, he starts working for people who are wrongly convicted and put on death row. And there's lots of stuff about systemic racism in there. I think just becoming acquainted and just becoming familiar with some of these issues is a really good place to start. I think the other thing is build relationships with people of different cultural backgrounds. Encourage your kids to do that as well. It's one thing to say, well, we're going to go and protest, we're going to go downtown, we're going to make a statement, we're going to march. Well, that's all well and good, but often what we find is that just kind of fizzles out over time. Then, okay, the march is over, and everybody all kind of goes home. But the real change happens in much less dramatic, I think, ways. And by the way, I'm not even saying people should never march. I'm just saying, let me say it even more bluntly. If people would, if the people who are on Facebook posting memes and sharing stuff all the time, if they would take half that time, okay, and this is my tongue-in-cheek remark, okay, but if they'd take half that amount of time and invest it in, mentoring a kid or doing something to care for their community, it's far less glamorous. You don't share about it, doesn't get on Facebook, but that's actually the stuff that I think makes a difference. Too often we think that making a difference today is all about, well, I posted something on Facebook, so I'm making a change, or I'm speaking out for change. And in reality, I just don't think that's the case. But I would say, build relationships with people who are of different cultural backgrounds, and not in a patronizing way, but just in a way to get to know them and get to appreciate and value what their culture is all about. The other thing is, in whatever sphere of influence you were in. So if you're if you're a manager of a company, if you work in your workplace, in your schools, whatever you can, be asking yourself the question: how might are there ways in which minorities may be disadvantaged? Not even necessarily that people are aware of, but just be sensitive to it, and then do what you can to work for and to promote equality of opportunity in those places. And then finally, just be aware of how our own biases may be unconscious, or they may be subconscious, right? They're not always right up front and center in our minds. but they might be there, and they might be shaping how we're talking, and we don't even realize it. So it's just kind of a way of saying, just asking yourself the question: do I have these biases that may kind of creep into the way that I think and act? I think those are the effective ways. Maybe there's more too, but I think those are effective ways. They're far less dramatic, and they're far less exciting than protesting and sharing stuff on Facebook. But I think those are the things that are actually often used in the long term to create change. So, okay. Questions, comments. I want to allow. We got a couple minutes as we kind of wrap up here, but I want to give an opportunity to anyone to fire out a question or comment or remark, if you have it, before I close things off. All right. Well, everybody, thank you for watching. Thanks for those that are tuning in a little later and watching this on the recorded version of it. Feel free to leave a comment either now or later on, and share your own thoughts with us. And thanks for joining me tonight. Appreciate it. Take care.